All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. It always makes a huge difference to know that people out there are invested in accessibility and equity. So the fact that we can see all your smiling faces, or I think see smiling faces, is pretty bright up here, means a lot. So before I forget, I'm going to start off by letting our panelists introduce themselves. Sean, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Dougherty. I am a low-vision user of assistive technology, and I work at an organization called Lighthouse San Francisco. I am the Director of Accessible User Experience, and my team is focused on usability testing of websites, apps, and products.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shah, and I'm an AR prototype engineer at Magic Leap. And my team at Magic Leap focuses on building a lot of the first-party applications and demo experiences, some that you can try here at our booth.
Hi, everyone. Ooh, that was loud. I'm Steph Hutka. I am the head of design research and founder of Sendful, a consultancy focused on helping teams build useful, usable, and desirable products for emerging markets, focused on spatial computing and the intersection with AI.
Awesome. And we did have a fourth panelist, Molly Bloom, who unfortunately could not be with us today due to a family emergency. But that being said, we're really excited to have a great panel here for y'all today. Now, before we get into it properly, I do want to make a disclaimer, which is that we're talking today about generative AI. And generative AI is unfortunately not quite what I would yet call a fully ethical technology. There's a lot of questions around Gen AI in terms of primarily compensation and recognition of the artists and other creators whose data fuels these AI models, as well as a number of questions about privacy, data ownership, intellectual property, transparency, author credit, who gets credited when you use an AI, many things like that to talk about. But we've decided here today to focus on the positive, which is the positive impact that Gen AI can make for folks that are disabled. So please take all that with a under note, and we definitely endorse having further discussions about those important ethical issues when it comes to the use of Gen AI. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So our first question is, why is it important to make XR creation accessible for everyone? Sean, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Sure. So my team works with blind and low vision individuals throughout the state of California, and we are trying to improve the accessibility of different experiences, including XR experiences. And what we found is that when you do consider perspectives of people with disabilities, you're able to create a product that is more optimized for everyone, and you get basically diverse perspectives on how that technology works, and usually it ends up leading to a more optimized design. So there are a lot of benefits for the overall user experience, but there's also benefits to being inclusive and encouraging diversity and inclusion across products and different experiences. So there's a wide range of benefits for doing so.
Yeah, when I think about generative AI and how XR needs to be more accessible, I think of it from a few different angles and perspectives. Currently, we have a rapidly aging population here in the U.S. and in the broader human population, and I think as that trajectory continues, there's going to be a larger and larger market opportunity to address those individuals and to really bring experiences that they can, fully take advantage of themselves. And I think, just like you were saying, Sean, I think about the curb cut effect, where creating experiences that are more accessible for those who are less abled can really make it more useful for everyone else as well. And so I think just having more accessible experiences in general is just an all-around win, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, building on what Ash said, I think we're all here because we're bullish about XR being the next computing paradigm. And there are still a number of barriers to entry to this medium for everyone, both on the consumption and creation side. And to the point of the curb cut effect, if we build for folks with permanent disabilities, that helps everyone. A great example of this at the recent Apple WWDC was the announcement of Vision OS 2, which included live captions. So live captions are very helpful for folks who are deaf or have a hearing impairment, but that also benefits people who are using the system in maybe very loud environments, or maybe you're using it in a quiet environment like a library, people who are non-native English speakers, people with dyslexia or autism, so that you can see how something like those live captions can really benefit everyone and help to break down barriers to using this medium.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question is around the challenges that disabled people face in creating XR content. And I want to focus on that word they're creating, because I think a lot of people in this room are probably already aware that disabled people have a lot of trouble even in accessing content itself. Just simple playback is oftentimes hard enough when, it seems the instant we moved to XR, we all forgot how to do captions. Right, captions is baked into so many 2D viewing platforms, and yet in 3D, it's everybody has to kind of make their own from the ground up, or at least that's how it's been until in the recent past. So today we're really focusing on that creation aspect. A lot of those tools like Udemy, Unreal, Web3, they each have their own challenges for disabled people to use in order to share their own stories. So I'd love to open up to our panelists here. What challenges do disabled people face in creating XR content?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. As you mentioned, XR by nature is highly visual, and my team does usability testing of websites and apps, and we still find a lot of gaps across the board, particularly with screen reader inaccessibility. And some of these gaps are things that can be pretty easily resolved, such as lack of element labels and alt text that's not there, and things of that nature. But when you start to get into design systems, tools that are dealing with visual content, those gaps are wider and harder to navigate. Oftentimes a tool might be accessible with the screen reader, kind of the basic functionality of that tool, but when you go to actually create something and you have an output that is a visually rendered image, that image is not usually accessible within that tool itself. You usually have to rely on an additional layer of assistive technology or kind of a workaround. And sometimes that workaround is relying on sighted assistance, which does limit the ability for someone with a disability to create content on their own and have their own autonomy as a creator.
Do you want to go?
Sure, I can jump in. So something that comes to mind with Dylan's question is this artifact that was created, an effort led by Dr. Regine Gilbert, who's a professor at New York University, and this XR city map, it was done in May of 2021, but it's still, from working in the XR industry for a long time, everything I'm about to say is still really relevant. So what Dr. Gilbert did was audit over 60 tools in the XR ecosystem and looked at a range of characteristics of these tools, such as their pricing model, level of accessibility, and so on. And some of the takeaways were, first off, just the ecosystem is vast and hard to break into. There's all of these different, if you look at even just game creation, there's all the different tools and all the different steps of your 3D pipeline, and then bringing that into a game engine, and that itself is a barrier to entry. And then layering on, when they did an accessibility audit on these tools, the vast majority of these tools did not have accessibility features, very limited accessibility documentation. I think that highlights this kind of intersection. Not only are these creation tools not at all optimized or even serving creators with disabilities, But it's also, like, to the curb cut effect, it's just hard to enter this world and this subway map. It's just as we navigate through a subway, that's how these different lines were charted with the different tools in the ecosystem. Highly suggest checking it out. It's a really cool visual.
I think for any of us in this industry, it's if you've ever tried to show a parent or a grandparent something in a headset, it's abundantly clear just how difficult it is to use some of the interfaces on these devices. A few years ago, I was loading up an experience on the Quest 2 for my grandfather. I showed him a 360 film of the Sistine Chapel, and he spent an hour in the headset just swiveling around in his chair, just looking at everything in that film. And he loved it so much, he took off the headset afterwards and he told me, "Don't tell your dad, I want you to buy me one of these headsets." And I did. And the sad thing is, like, he's tried so many times to use this device on his own, but he'll try to navigate this experience. He uses the hand tracking, he uses the controller, but he just can't get through the experience to even start an app or a film, so there's just so many fundamental barriers for people like my grandfather who has had multiple strokes that has left him severely less abled as time has gone on. And so I think that's, at a base point, something that really drives me to create more accessible experiences. And I think something like generative UI, powered by some kind of generative AI, could be really key and fundamental towards creating more accessible content before we even get to the creation aspect of it all.
Right. I think the power of Gen AI is not only in creating content itself, it's about choosing how to interact with that content, right? The ability to create your own user interface, something that's really powerful. Now, I don't know that we've quite gotten there yet in terms of Gen AI. I know some of the talks so far at the conference here have been blowing my mind in terms of what's possible, because I think so far we've seen mostly kind of content generation. But even within that, I'd love to just very briefly talk about what is the current state of kind of Gen AI for 3D, for XR content right now? How's it going to change in the coming years? And I think on a similar note, what aspects of creating XR content are easier or more difficult to do with Gen AI, right? If you had somebody who was, say, quadriplegic or blind or otherwise had a disability, what would be the easiest and the hardest parts for them to do as it stands, and how can Gen AI help bridge that gap?
I can jump in for the first half of the question around the current tooling. So in the 3D space, we have several tools out there where you have text to 3D. So you have a text prompt, generates a 3D model. 3DFi, Bezier are a couple that come to mind. And we also have a number of tools here to help us generate code. So for example, even just using ChatGPT or Copilot if you already have some developer skills. Now, note, none of these are specifically talking about accessibility for creators with disabilities. This is just general tooling that exists. And so I think thinking about what might be coming next, like we see, for example, with ChatGPT 4 Omega, highly multimodal system that you can interact with voice, with the latency of person-to-person conversation, so really low latency. So I'm hopeful that we'll see an expansion of the inputs and outputs of these tools so that you can very naturalistically and with different levels of ability or different types of inputs that you want to use, start to generate the content that you might use to populate your AR or VR world.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that from an accessibility standpoint, from what I've seen working with the disability community, that there are a lot of opportunities for Gen AI tools to help with certain aspects of accessibility. Things like providing alt text of images, being able to describe video content, and kind of change the way that you're interacting with experiences that can help bridge some of those gaps, and even being able to process images in real time, whether that's in the real world or digitally, and get a pretty accurate description back of what's there. So Gen AI is serving as a bit of a assistive technology as well that I think can help close the gap with creators.
Yeah, I think some of the state of the art for Gen AI is like it's so enticing. You know, it looks from a distance that it's so powerful, and you just want to jump in and try it yourself. But once you start really approaching it, you realize there's so many gaps, there's so many flaws. A friend of mine, Ian, who runs Pencil along with Tani, he told me a really great quote. He's like, if you tried to use like even any of the AI chat tools for developers to help them with coding, if you still need some fundamental knowledge of engineering and coding to utilize those, because if you didn't, it would be kind of like as if you used autocomplete on your phone to talk to your friends and only autocomplete. You'd get somewhere, but not where you want by any means. And I think that itself is somewhat of a barrier. Like, I think when we get to a point where generative AI, these coding tools, these art tools can begin to kind of merge together into like multimodality is where things start to get a bit more user-friendly for those of us who maybe have less experience in those specific domains. And I think a great example of that is what ChatGPT is doing with their new GPT-4o model. Some of you may have seen their like recent demos that they've put out where they've shown someone who had vision loss using the live voice and vision model to navigate streets where the model was telling this person exactly how far to walk, exactly when to stop, where to go, turn left, turn right, and also describing the world in a conversational experience all in real time, to the point where the person was able to stop at the exact correct point before getting too far and crossing the street.
Awesome. So I think that the next question is, we just talked about if you are a solo creator, if you're trying to kind of start with nothing but yourself and an AI tool, how far can you get? Now let's talk about the idea of facilitating teamwork between disabled and non-disabled people. What are some of the possibilities there for AI and for Gen AI? And how can we use these tools to help bridge the gaps that currently exist between different types of collaborators? And Sean, maybe you can take the lead on this one.
Sure. Yeah, I think when you have this type of collaboration between disabled and non-disabled creators, you do start to understand these gaps and these types of challenges, and you start to incorporate different users' perspectives. And that's incredibly valuable in trying to get to ultimately a universal design, something that works well for the majority of users as kind of a baseline. And so I think AI tools can help close those gaps, but I think it's also the conversations involving the disability community from the beginning will really help inform the best design for these types of design systems to create XR content, and will help really see what are the gaps and how can those best be solved and how AI tools can really help.
Right. Yeah. Because just to add on to that, we always like to look to tech to solve these solutions, to solve these problems for us, right, and to completely solve the problem. But it always has to start with people and organizations, right? The orgs need to make an effort to be inclusive before any amount of tooling is going to help then bridge the gap. Steph, Ash, did you have anything you want to add on that one before we go on?
Maybe I can add a little bit around collaboration. This is less than maybe a workplace example, but thinking in an educational context. I'm an instructor at Berkeley, and I'm thinking about different accommodations. Like when you provide accommodations for a student with disabilities, that actually helps the entire class. Like when you're captioning your images or you're offering like an online option. So thinking about, this kind of goes back to the curb cut effect. So if you want to think of that as collaboration, again, just showing how that accessible approach really benefits everyone. That's all. That was my 2 cents.
Absolutely. So I think next up, we're thinking about creating these accessible interfaces, right? This is something that I've heard a lot of hype about in terms of the possibilities of AI, but still seems a little bit removed from what we've seen so far. And so I'd love to just explore a little bit in terms of when it comes to making it easier to use existing technology, what types of modifications are going to be helpful? What types of modifications are going to be possible using Gen AI? And how can these fit into existing systems like plugins, for example? For, in an ideal world, disabled people to be able to empower themselves to have a better interface and then share that interface with other folks around the world in order to have a kind of democratization effect on the technology.
Yeah, along these lines, I like to think about customization of settings so that users can rely on different types of input and output methods when creating content. So as we mentioned before, that Gen AI has kind of closed the gap a little bit around coding, that you still need coding skills, but you can at least get started. I think if you could use something like voice input to be able to create visual-based content, that's going to be a big starting point and close a gap for some of the disability community. But also things like looking at other output methods as well, ability to use text-to-speech, for example, that's native to the platform and something that you can turn on or off as a setting. So I think it comes down to a high degree of customization within the platform and the user interface.
I think a great example of some accessibility work is done by Microsoft's Xbox team and how they've created this set of configurable controller elements to, people's accessibility needs it's such a wide spectrum, and it's not a one-dimensional spectrum, it's a multi-dimensional spectrum. Like one solution that works for one person is not gonna work for the next person. And I think what they've done by creating this controller system that you can attach buttons and knobs and levers to engage with the games and experiences that everyone else can engage with, I think that is so cool that they've been able to accomplish something like that. And I know PlayStation is kind of now starting to do the same thing. And I hope that one day there could be something like that for XR, where maybe we have a controller that is fully customizable. You can configure it however you want. You can put a knob on the side, maybe a trigger in the exact spot where it works for you. That's something that I think I could be really excited about. And I also think about hypothesizing about maybe something like a generative UI, where maybe there's, I don't think we're quite here yet, and I don't think we're at a point where this could be reliable enough yet, maybe a few generations down the road, but imagine some kind of AI director that is holding your hand through an experience. If it sees that you're having some kind of difficulty, it can direct you and put you on the right path. Maybe if headsets one day have some kind of brain-computer interface built in, sensing your brain waves, it can understand what your intent is and guide you softly to where you need to go to experience what you want to experience.
I think maybe adding on to what Ash and Sean have already said, thinking too about how compatible our XR headsets are with assistive technologies, stick soft mouse or screen reader, can we interface between these technologies and our headsets and ensuring that that is possible? And I can think of that not only from the consumption perspective, but also from the creation perspective, thinking about having worked on tools for designers and artists in the past, leading design research for those initiatives. The kind of the name of the game was always to minimize that time between building and testing and building for the medium in the medium. So by being able to customize your controller set, that will also help accelerate your workflow and keep you kind of in that creative flow.
Mm-hmm. And then I think next I'd love to ask, when it comes to the effects of kind of democratizing the tools of creation, right? Being able to let more people more easily create new software, new applications. I know we've talked a lot about, there's a lot of fear around the conference and elsewhere about AI killing jobs, but thinking about what AI could do for employment in terms of opening up the tools and potentially opening up the roles that do exist to people that couldn't access them before. I'd love to hear input. Sean certainly have input on the disability employment aspect, but then Ash or Steph, if you could talk about effects you've seen on just what happens when we make it easier for people to create content.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to see a road where it gets so easy to create content that what's the point of having any employees at all? And maybe that whole process can be automated. You know, the idea people are going to be the ones that control the world at that point. But I think, yeah, like, I think there's a point where there's going to be a tiny sliver of time where we can create anything we want and everyone is still employable, and it's going to be a great period of time.
Enjoy that 10 minutes, folks.
Yeah, given that I work with the blind and low vision community, when I think about the disabled community, a lot of my experience is kind of through that lens. And so I think about the opportunity to create visual content in a non-visual way. So by using things like voice input, for example, to be able to create that visual content, and then be able to process it with AI and image recognition software to understand a very realistic description of what's there. And also considering different modalities, things like haptic feedback, soundification, and focusing on those aspects, not just the visual aspects. And so I think that can help kind of close the gap, and then I think it could create an opportunity where there's a lot of positions in companies that are typically very visual, such as design roles, marketing roles, and if these gaps are reduced through AI, it could allow someone who's blind or low vision to really excel in those types of roles, where historically maybe they would just be a coder because it's a little bit easier to be a blind coder because code is very accessible to screen readers and zoom magnification tools, for example. So I think it could, particularly for the blind and low vision community, close a lot of gaps around roles that are usually very, very visual and require a lot of sighted access.
I think adding on around what does making these tools more accessible mean for the type of roles that we'll see. I think something that I've talked a lot about with folks who are creating content in various capacities is for folks who are just entering the content creation world, how, let's say if you wanted to go into videography, previously you might needed to have purchased expensive equipment and licenses to even make a short film. Now you can take this more sort of systems approach and more take on the sort of creative director role and be able to break into that field, but that by no means is replacing the skill set of an experienced videographer. I think where we need to be careful when we're designing these tools is being very intentional about what parts of the workflow we are automating. I was just talking to a 3D artist on the floor yesterday about this. Like, instead of creating creating variations of reference art, for example, that might be using or built off of different folks' style, like why not like add some more UV mapping automation or like those parts of the workflow that are really really painful. So there's opportunity for AI to jump in there to help accelerate folks who already have that expertise. So I think it depends what jumping in point you're looking at, if you're just brand new to creation or if you're an experienced creator.
Right.
I would love for AI to take over UV mapping. Please,
Yes.
someone figure that out.
Startups in the audience, like, does this not exist?
Yeah. Well, and I think a large part of that too is feedback, right? Because I think one of the places that we're missing that we have a gap right now is, you're just talking about letting people who are blind, for example, be able to create visual imagery. But then if you don't have a good idea of what you just created, it can be very hard to iterate. So I think being able to go back and forth between having it pop something out and then telling you, besides just what prompt you used, give you information about what has been created, right? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And then, Ash, from your perspective, maybe like when you're working on an application, what is the key information that you're using when you're choosing to tweak something this way or that way? Like, what is the key information you use, and then can GenAI provide that kind of information? I guess maybe that might not even be GenAI, that might just be AI plain and simple. Well, nothing plain and simple about AI, but I'd love to hear opinions about that, and otherwise about the feedback cycle for creating new stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback cycle is kind of what drives a lot of us to XR in the first place. That especially those of us that come from other older design industries, where the idea that you can create something and then just see it manifested in front of you and interact with it, I think that is what brings a lot of us here. And I think for generative AI to really like be assistive in that aspect, if you're someone who's first approaching this industry or someone who is less abled, it has to like really understand beyond the prompt. It has to not only give you what you've prompted, but it has to understand how that element that it's returned affects the rest of what you're creating. It has to understand the ripple effects it itself is creating. And it has to have an understanding of like the holistic picture of what you are creating. So it can't just be just the single prompt that you've given it that it has as a reference. It has to have, for example, in a Unity case, it has to have your whole Unity project. It has to have your whole code base. Maybe it even has your Unity library folder, so it knows when to delete that Unity library folder. And I just think it's going to be a while before we get there, because it just requires so much data and memory to be encapsulated within a prompt structure that like we're not fully there yet in terms of the capabilities of LLMs. But even something like GPT-4o, where it can now have vision capabilities, so it can actually see your screen while you are talking to it. That is, I think, a step in the right direction, because it can tell you how to do something, and then it itself can see what that response was from what it told you to do. I think that is super useful.
Yeah, I think that real-time processing can really help close the gap, because there are a lot of tools out there on the assistive technology side that have been able to process images for quite a while. Tools like Seeing AI, Be My Eyes now has an AI-based Be My AI capability. And some of these tools, when they first came out, were useful, but there was kind of a lag in the processing time, and it wasn't really like a real-time processing capability. And I think if we move in that direction, it will really help allow creators with disabilities to be able to not only make things through different input methods, but be able to understand what they've actually created. So as you mentioned, Dylan, kind of that feedback cycle, and it really empowers creators. Instead of just being able to create something and then have to rely on a non-disabled person to understand what it is and how it fits in.
Absolutely. I'm going to switch tacks just a little bit here and talk about the output of Gen AI. And then right after that, we'll start taking questions from the audience, because I'm sure all of you have your own unique experience with your own disabilities or the disabilities of your family or friends. And I definitely want to be able to make sure to take some questions from the audience. So when it comes to generating accessible content, I think there's a lot of kind of open questions right now. And I think the two I would want to explore was, first, there's a lot of concern over algorithmic bias, right? If the data that machines are trained on is, for example, racist, then you get racist output. And now I think a lot of the AI companies have been trying to train that stuff out, but there's a very deep vein of ableism, I think, that runs throughout a lot of our data now and historically. And so I'd love to talk about how do we kind of identify ableism in data? How do we identify where there isn't good data regarding disabled people? And then how do we make sure that our outputs of these Gen AIs are not, either making ableist statements or otherwise discriminatory?
I might be able to jump in on the last part in terms of the output, and something I wanted to plug throughout this talk. And like, yes, I get my opportunity now, is trying to invite, whenever possible, disabled creators into your software development. So if you're building a new tool for creating 3D assets or creating interactive VR experiences, bringing in disabled creators and co-creating throughout the process, not just like a one and done sort of extractive session, but building with them as subject matter experts and having them try the tools and provide feedback in that iterative loop. It's like the rallying cry of like nothing about us without us. And so I think that's one thing I want to really emphasize to to do that. And I've seen models of this work, like analogs of this, where you have like artist in residency programs. This was something Adobe did when I was part of the founding team for Adobe Aero. And like, right at basically day one, something that the team established was every quarter inviting 3 artists from different backgrounds, thinking very like inclusively, very accessibly, and folks would just create, sort of banging on the pipes with whatever tooling even before we had something built, and learning from their experiences, and also just kind of like broadening the aperture of what was possible with the medium. So I know it can be done. So encourage folks to do that. I know there were at least 2 other parts to your question, Dylan. So maybe that's an
Sorry,
Ash
I've
and
been
Sean
asking
part.
really long and rambling questions. That's my bad. Yeah, just in terms of identifying ableism. I mean, maybe Sean or Ash, you could give an example of ableism, and then we could kind of talk about how that type of thing manifests in AI right now.
One thing I would say, and we've had some conversations with Meta and other providers in this space about this, but avatars and kind of what is considered a standard avatar, what are the customizations and things that can be included in an avatar, historically hasn't really included people with disabilities. So things like white canes, guide dogs, hearing aids. Those haven't really been considered in the past, and now a lot of companies are starting to think about how those graphical elements can be incorporated into an avatar, and they're reaching out to the disabled community to get that feedback. And so I think that's a useful example that comes to mind.
Absolutely. And then the other aspect of kind of accessible content generation here I'm thinking of is, a lot of the time, as we we're just talking about the feedback loop, right? Right now you pop out an AI image and that's it. That's all you get is the image itself, right? And so thinking about the other types of kind of multimodal feedback that are helpful, popping out alt text or text equivalents, thinking when you're creating videos to do video descriptions, or a big one is haptic feedback, right? Don't just generate something visual, but generate the sound or the haptic experience that will go with it. What do we think are the current weaknesses and opportunities for Gen AI to make sure that we're not just creating these kind of purely visual worlds, but that we have really fully fleshed out and multimodal experiences that can work for people with a variety of senses?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just takes a lot of development time to begin with. You got to really be able to flesh out whatever you're creating. You got to really consider all aspects of it. And like you said, Steph, bringing in people into the fold in the research aspect of it, doing demos and doing testing, and like seeing where those gaps are, I think is very key to getting that like holistic accessibility aspect in terms of the feedback loop. I love that, what you said about the haptics and getting that in there. Like, I think that's something that I hope AI can, one day be sophisticated enough and holistic enough that it can like begin to trigger those kind of responses in like a dynamic experience. I think that kind of stuff is like extremely cool.
It can help establish the baseline around accessibility to your point, Dylan, about the gaps in things like alt text, and those take a lot of time to type out. So if AI can create a really accurate alt text that's just there by default and can help describe things in a way that makes sense, it just saves a lot of time, and it optimizes the experience even further.
Yeah, I'll note as well when it comes to alt text, context is very important in alt text, right? If you have a picture of George Washington, if it's an article about American history, the alt text might be the first president of the United States. But if it's an article about dentistry, then it might be a man with wooden teeth, right? And so making sure that AI has the context awareness necessary for that to generate alt text, maybe even on the fly, depending on what the user is doing, what tool they're in, could be really valuable.
And some of that comes down to the customization within settings as well. When we think about screen readers, we think about verbosity, which is basically like how much feedback are you getting, what level of detail, and so the ability to adjust verbosity and even the feedback you're getting around alt text for situational aspects is an important dynamic.
Absolutely. All right, well, before we get to audience questions, I just want to give each of you an opportunity to say, basically, what do you think it's important for the creators of these Gen AI software to hear? What should our audience members take away? And if these words should reach the ears of the folks that are programming these models, what can they do to improve the experience for disabled folks?
I think where I sit, focusing on digital accessibility, we talk a lot about shifting left and really considering users with disabilities in the earliest stages possible of the design process and creation process. And it can really optimize the experience and help ensure that accessibility is considered throughout and instead of an afterthought. So I think that's my biggest message.
Yeah, I think I would just echo the same thing, bringing users earlier into the fold that have these accessibility needs and really understanding what kind of settings and sliders and toggles and just what can you put in an app that or in a generative AI experience that can really help dial it in for these folks. I think, you don't know what you don't know, and to know, you got to take the steps to figure it out.
Yes, to everything Sean and Ash just said. I think I would hope that more creators of these tools would take to heart what we've been talking about, this curb cut effect. I don't know if we actually defined it earlier, but it was in the 70s, disability rights activists lobbied to get basically the curb cut or like the ramp in our sidewalks, and that not only help folks who use wheelchairs, but people with strollers or tourists with their luggage, and it just helps everyone. Like the live caption example we heard earlier, like I think there's often companies, there's this question about, who is our target audience? Is this the largest total addressable market? But if you look at curb cut effect, like those live captions, okay, if we prioritize building for folks who have hearing impairments, that helps everyone. It's not only the right thing to do, it also that has that benefit to that whole broad user base like I was talking about earlier. So curb cut affects creators.
And a lot of those features have actually moved into mainstream technology as well, like things like dark mode, even using voice input with smart assistants. Like we're now also used to using those things. We don't even think twice, but they all started out in the disability space, right? So,
absolutely, yeah. If you ever used a remote control, thank the curb cut effect, because those were originally made for disabled folks. Well, fantastic. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Looks like we've got about 10 minutes here. I'd love to hear what thoughts have been provoked, what questions folks have, and we can give them a round of discussion as the microphone makes its way.
Thank you, everyone. This is a really great talk. I took like 3 pages of notes, so thank you so much for your insight. I want to go back to the question about ableism and algorithmic bias. Part of the issue with developing models that include everyone is they need to be trained on data that includes everyone. And obviously, when we start talking about disability communities, this can be a very sensitive aspect of identity, especially thinking about things like avatars, where we want to have tools that allow people to represent themselves, but also are obviously collecting information about how people want to identify that may be sensitive. So curious if there's thoughts from this panel about how we can be building out data sets in a privacy protecting and ethical way that still takes into account the lived experiences, appearances, and needs and discussions of the disabled community. Thanks.
I think I can, I'll start that one off. This is Sean. I think not being afraid to ask those tough questions. I do a lot of user research with the blind and low vision community, and sometimes we have to ask those kind of hard questions when we're gathering demographic information or putting together profiles for specific studies. Of course, it's a whole nother area, right, about like how you ask the question, right? But being willing to ask it, usually people are receptive and they actually want to give feedback on their experience because they understand that that's the only way that it can be incorporated and considered. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add to that, trust is a huge issue here, right? It can be very hard to give a big company your name, your disability status, which can potentially be used against you in a number of ways. So I think, I know for us, working with organizations that represent disabled communities and have that trust, like Lighthouse, for example, has been really helpful, right? Because you have that third party that will help facilitate that open exchange of information and know that your identity will be trusted. Yeah. Great. Next question.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. I really enjoyed this panel. I think it's also important for us to distinguish the difference between sensory disabilities as well as cognitive disabilities. We had contracted a development company to create a VR game for exercise physiology students, and the lead developer had attention to detail. He was absolutely amazing, and only at the end we found out that he had autism. And when we talk about the multimodal feedback or multi-senses in that loop, how do you navigate that balance between having as much senses as possible for the one half of people with disabilities, and when senses might be too much for others that might also find that sensory regulation to be too much to regulate? So that's the question. And then just a very quick comment is what we learned from the International Paralympic Committee is that it would be appropriate to regard it as athletes with disabilities or people with disabilities and not necessarily disabled people or disabled athletes. So that was just something that they had taught us. So that's just a quick comment. But I think my question is around the navigating of the balance between that sensory input and sensory output. How does one establish that balance in the development process?
Absolutely. I would just comment on the last part first. I totally hear you. I think we originally had for XR Access, virtual augmented mixed reality for people with disabilities, and I've variously gotten feedback from people that no, it should be for disabled people or it should be for people with disabilities. So I think it's definitely a cultural issue, but hopefully, people respect that both are intended respectfully.
Yeah, I can just add to that. There's a lot of debate in the disabled community, and it kind of depends on which part of the community you ask. A lot of blind people will just say, I'm blind, or I'm a blind person, instead of saying, I'm a person who is blind. So it really just depends, and again, comes down to asking people their preferences is kind of the best way to navigate that aspect.
Yeah.
I think going back to your core question about, what can we do during the development process for this? And I think about a lot what you just said, in one of the previous questions, adding a level of configurability for, accessibility settings. So like you mentioned, accessibility needs, they're not one-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional. And one person's experience is going to be completely different than the next person's experience. So creating a level of configurability that can hopefully cover a large enough spectrum is key.
One thing that comes to mind there, it's not an XR game, but The Last of Us Part 2, it has really built in a lot of accessibility features. But the cool thing about it is those features are highly customizable. So they're there, but the user can choose to kind of turn them on or turn them off as needed. So again, I think it does come down to that customization.
Yeah, I was just going to layer on the configurability and customization aspect and combining that with what we were talking about earlier about bringing in folks with autism into the development process. So if you have a sense of, someone who's very sensitive to different modalities, sort of what might be those triggers, and then you can kind of work backwards, and especially if you speak with a lot of folks, you'll have a good sense of, what might we need to be able to turn down or up or, in our experience. So I think, yes, that participatory design aspect and then the configurability.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really great opportunities for generative AI is this idea that we could have a customizable interface where you put somebody in a kind of calibration environment and say, go ahead and adjust this slider until it's at the level of external stimulation that's comfortable to you, whether it's just the main things that need to move or having all the bells and whistles. So being able to make sure that we build our AIs in a way that are customizable in that way is definitely going to be important. More questions?
When it comes to development teams that are smaller and don't have a lot of funds, a lot of times it feels like trying to incorporate the accessibility features can potentially take up a lot of the time and potentially, prevent the main development of what you are trying to build. when it comes to, I guess, standards, are there packs like available that have sort of standardized some of these accessibility things so that it becomes easier to incorporate these into projects that might not have the time and space to be customizing those things on their own?
Absolutely. Well, I can speak to that a little bit as, so I think Tanya introduced me. I'm the Director of Operations for XR Access, and that's basically our whole jam, right? We're very much trying to make it easier for developers and designers in order to reduce that barrier, because you're right, it shouldn't be up to indie developers to reinvent the wheel from scratch and code all of these accessibility functions from the ground up. So if you go to xraccess.org/GitHub, you'll find a number of resources that we've compiled to try to support that, including a few open source code implementations for things like captions, although not nearly as many as we'd like. You can also join, if you go to xraccess.org/Slack, we have a community of people that are always experimenting with this type of thing and can hopefully help support that as well.
I think one thing to add to that, I would say, the earlier you start with accessibility needs in mind, the better, because I find as I'm working on a project, oftentimes you'll create, some kind of a feature or some kind of a tool within your experience, within your game, within your app, where it could be, a few lines of code, maybe putting a slider here or there to turn that into something that the user has a little bit of control now over. Maybe instead of it just being a fixed text size, you could put a slider for, making the text variable size width. And I think starting early and having a system built up to kind of capture those moments as you're going through the development process. So it's almost like you're ambiently adding more and more accessibility things just as they pop up in your game, as you're going on, is I think the kind of technique that I would approach with.
Another important aspect is having an inaccessible design system with the components library that you can pull from that is already accessible. And this is something that we focus on when we work with designers and developers around apps and websites. But a lot of these standards are not necessarily in place for XR, which is to the work Dylan was speaking to with XR Access, what they're trying to achieve, and what Lighthouse is partnered with them on some of those initiatives, because it is kind of the Wild West from that standpoint. But I think that would be the end goal, would be to have those design systems for XR that you can pull from, that components are already there that have accessibility baked in, and that's a really good starting point. It doesn't solve all the problems, but at least get you started with baseline accessibility.
And shout out to Apple for actually doing that for the Vision Pro, because they do have some amount of screen reader support and accessible components by default, which is really powerful.
Yeah, glad you mentioned that, Dylan. That was something I was like, maybe this is too much of a blue sky thing to say at the end of the panel, but seeing that we're here defining this new medium, I think one of the tensions is okay, do we have too many standards when we're still defining sort of what the overall playbook is? But we need some standards to the point of this is not on indie shops to reinvent the wheel. So kind of finding that balance point, but to the point of Apple, we have this big company showing an example of what it could look like to lead accessibility first, and as we redefine this medium, what would that look like if that was the approach that we took? So you could say, hey, Steph, maybe that's too pie in the sky, but maybe that's an optimistic lens for all of us who are big on XR.
I think the earlier we can get that built in, the better it'll be for everybody. Because I'll add one last thing, and I think we're getting kicked off here, which is that when it's tempting to think of accessibility as, I'm putting all of this time and effort into this feature that only some tiny percentage of people are going to use. But I think the two things you realize is, first, way more people than you think are going to use it. And second is that when you're making something accessible to people, you're often also making it accessible to machines and to your algorithms. You look at something like captions in Altspace. Microsoft did a bunch of work in order to make captions possible, and then they were one step away from having real-time translation, because all of that infrastructure that they put in for captions, they could then apply to other features. And I think you'll find that a lot of the time. When you think about it from the start, about making your applications modular and making them flexible enough to provide inputs and outputs in different forms, you now have an application that is so much less rigid and so much more open to all of these new possible applications and implementations that I've never heard anybody say, well, I spent all this time on accessibility features and I never got anything out of it. It's always, I spent all this time on accessibility features and oh my God, that was an amazing decision because it let us do all of these other things I hadn't even thought of. So I think with that, last words before we're booted off here?
Well, I was just going to add to that usually it simplifies the design. It just makes a more streamlined design overall. So at the very least, that's usually what you get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think my last 2 cents was I talked a lot about bringing folks with disabilities into the design research process, and I'm not mistaken, that wonderful GitHub that you shared, you also share some resources on platforms to work with folks with disabilities and bring them into the design research process. Have I got that? Have I got that right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah.
I would just add and echo what you guys just said. Start early. If you're thinking about accessibility needs, just start early. The sooner the better.
All right. Well, thanks everybody so much for coming. Really appreciate your being here. And feel free to reach out, info@xraccess.org. We'll help you out as much as we can. All right. Thanks all.